Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to everyone, and welcome to the North Carolina History Center and Tryon Palace. We have an exciting program lined up for you this evening. My name is Crystal Regan, and I'm the Executive Director here at Tryon Palace. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight and for supporting the programming here at Tryon Palace. I'd like to take just a moment to recognize the Tryon Palace commissioners. If we have commissioners in the audience, if you'd raise your hand or stand, and our foundation board members, if you are here, wave your hand or stand. Thank you so much. For being with us tonight. I want to encourage you, if you're not currently a member of our foundation board, I want to encourage you to support these programs and help support all the amazing events that are happening here at Tryon Palace and the things that make Tryon Palace significant. This is our original seat of government, which most of you know. We're working towards our semi-quincentennial, which is America 250, and many eyes across the nation will be on Tryon Palace. And I think it would be great if you were a part of those celebrations. So if you're not involved, get involved, join our foundation. I want to take a moment to recognize Miss Ann Shout. If you would stand, please. I want you all to see this lady. Ms. Shout is the current president of the foundation. She is here ready and willing to take your money, your donations, and your time, should you decide you want to be a part of this amazing institution. So make sure you talk with Ann about ways in which you can get information about how to support Tryon Palace. We'd also like for you to join us immediately after this program for a light reception so that we can talk and engage and talk about the program and that you can ask questions of our distinguished speakers who are going to join us tonight. And that reception will be in Maddox Hall. So make sure you join us right outside these doors. Now I'd like to introduce our distinguished speakers for tonight. Lindy Cummings was born and raised in Northeast Indiana. She holds a BA in history from Indiana Purdue University, Fort Wayne, a Master of Arts from Miami University of Ohio, and completed additional graduate work at University of Maryland, College Park. Her area of interest is 18th century cultural history. Lindy has worked in museums in Indiana, Ohio, and Maryland. And in 2016, she joined Tryon Palace. Lindy currently serves as our research historian and our interim head of education. She is irreplaceable and has done amazing work here at Tryon Palace. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Lindy Cummings. Nelson McDaniel is a native New Bernian. He is a historian and a longtime member of the Tryon Palace Commission. Nelson has served the New Bern community in many capacities over the decades. He is an active member of Christ Church and has served on numerous boards, committees, and foundations, including Camp Seagull, Camp Seafair, the Tryon Palace Foundation, and the New Bern Historical Society, just to mention a few. While he grew up in New Bern, Nelson lived in the Washington, D.C. area for much of his adult life before returning to New Bern. The period of planning and rebuilding of the palace was an important part of his youth in New Bern from 1952 to 1959. And he has a firsthand account of all of the excitement and the meaningful mission surrounding the rebuilding of our magnificent palace. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Nelson McDaniel.
Good evening.
Hello. Hello to everyone out here, too.
Crystal gave us that nice introduction. I thought we were just going to be sitting in chairs and have an Alistair Cook moment. But turned out that wasn't the case. And if you recognize who Alistair Cook is, you're too old to be here at night by yourself. So,
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming out this evening. Nelson and I have gotten together about, I don't know, 3 times now, and talked about a lot of different things. And one of the things that struck me after every one of our conversations is this history, and all history really, is like a prism. And you hold it up, and you twist it, and the light refracts, and you get maybe violet, or red, or green, or yellow, or indigo. And we're going to be twisting the prism a little bit tonight and refracting the light in certain ways, but it's certainly not all the stories, and it's not all the ways of seeing the palace's history. And we could have many, many other evenings like this. So if we don't mention a particular part of the palace's history, it's only because we want everyone to be able to get out and get to bed at a decent hour. Otherwise, we'll be here until the wee hours of the morning. All right. I always like to begin with an overview of the palace in its first iteration. And I think everyone here is probably pretty familiar with it, but we'll do it anyway. The original Tryon Palace was built between 1767 and 1770. It was the first permanent capital building in the province, what was a colonial province at the time, and it was called the most beautiful building in North America at the time. It was a rare example of a purpose-built government building in the North American colonies. This was not common to other colonies. And it remained our official capital until the capital was shifted to Raleigh in 1794. And in 1798, the building was burned, just the main structure. The kitchen and the stable office did survive. The kitchen office, it's not really clear when it was lost, but sometime probably in the first quarter of the 19th century. But the stable office was transformed and is our only original structure from that period. And what really fascinates me about this earliest version of the palace is that it takes on this mythical quality in the 19th century. And as much as any representation of royal authority kind of gets a bad rap, and it's, we want to kind of distance ourselves. It's like that youthful relationship, you distance yourself from your parents by, pointing out all their faults and criticizing them. So we kind of did that in the 19th century, distancing ourselves from Great Britain. But the palace never gets tarred with that brush. There's always this curiosity. What did it look like? Where was it? And the stories, of course, are most of the time, more fanciful than accurate, but I think it speaks to people's fascination with it. And there's this burning public curiosity about what it looked like.
Yeah, Lindy, before we leave that slide,
Yes.
It's worth noting that this etching was done by Louis Orr, who was a New Englander who came to North Carolina, did many buildings in North Carolina, but the most significant number in New Bern. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is 2 years before the palace reconstruction began. And Louis Orr was, I believe, eventually the only American etch artist, the first American etch artist to be exhibited at the Louvre in Paris. So he was quite, and many people around the state have these originals. I have 3, I'm happy to say. But it's quite remarkable to me that he was drawing from descriptions primarily, right. Since there was no such building in place when he did that. Right.
I think in 1950 he at least had the benefit of maybe looking at the original blueprints, but that could have. But yeah, it's still an amazing engraving. All right, so early recognition of the palace starts in this historical moment that I find particularly fascinating. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of our nation's history, but around the time of the 100th anniversary of our nation's history, you have this turn towards the past, this recognition. History actually becomes a legitimate profession. They're going to Germany to be trained, so there's interest in exploring the past and understanding the past. And it's at this moment when North Carolinians are most curious and most determined to start thinking about reconstructing the palace. So 1893, Chicago World Fair, There's a group of 3 North Carolinian women, and their vision is to reconstruct the palace at the World's Fair. Now, how they were going to do this, I'm not quite clear because, remember, no one knew what it looked like. But they were going to build a dimensionally accurate building. The General Assembly declined to fund that with taxpayer money, so nothing came of that. And then in 1922, the North Carolina colonial dames, they put up a historical marker at the existing stable office. And so the photograph you see here is one by Baird Wooten, another New Bernian, and she was taking photographs all across the state.
One of the things I love about this is, again, it was the only existing building, but there are a couple of wonderful little stories about this building. It was used as an apartment building through its history, a school and various things, but also an apartment building. And a few of you may have known Nora and Lefty Kennel, and they had their family there, and their son Robbie, who is still living, reminds me regularly that he was born in this stable, and that the only other guy he knows born in a stable gets a lot of attention. And he calls me regularly to see if we can have a plaque put on there. And the other story I love, David Ward once told me, and of course David's father was so involved in all of this, and David had a summer job cleaning that stucco off of those bricks. They had stuccoed over the bricks of the stable, and he said it was that summer job working in the heat with that lime dust that convinced him that he needed to go to law school.
So out of that early recognition comes one of the first definitive efforts to reconstruct the palace. And of course, leading that charge is Minnette Chapman Duffy. Not a native New Bernian, but a Tennessean. And you have thoughts on Tennesseans' relationship to New
Yes,
Bernians.
as you know, Tennessee was part of North Carolina, and it only broke off relatively late, so I consider people from Tennessee at least part North Carolinian. In fact, as you probably know, Nashville, Tennessee was named for Francis Nash, Revolutionary War hero. Francis Nash never went to Nashville, Tennessee. He never went to Tennessee. So I think the people of Nashville are just living in a suburb of New Bern. But at any rate, she's a wonderful example of the kind of person who came here. She married into a New Bern family, the Duffy family. She came here and instantly fell in love with the story, the architecture. She was extraordinarily bright. And so she should get a tremendous amount of credit for inspiring this dream. In fact, I think we have sitting right here a book by David Brooks about her life story. And if you're interested in all of this, it's well worth reading. She was a remarkable person. And by the way, if you know Carol Kemp, who is on the Tryon Palace Commission, this is her great-grandmother.
So I think one of the most fascinating things about Minnette for me is that she's an example of one way that women are becoming more engaged. Not necessarily, I mean, she's working in the 1920s, so there's also that drive to get the franchise. But not every woman is necessarily comfortable with that kind of political activism. But there's this new idea of like social engagement with clubs and outreach, and I think Minnette is just a wonderful example of someone who is, still the wife of a leading physician, still the mother of children, but is deeply engaged in her community in really dynamic ways that are continuing to ripple through into the present. She founds the New Bern Historical Society in her parlor. She is, working in 1927 to start fundraising for a grand pageant that sort of recreated New Bern's history. And I had no idea, but one of the things that Mr. Brooks talks about in his book is that pageants were the thing in this period. So if anybody's familiar with Horn of the West or the Lost Colony, these are these grand pageants that came out of this period. So I often wonder, This New Bern pageant in 1929, it was massive. It took up an entire day, multiple sites around town. I think if we're frustrated with traffic at the New Bern Christmas parade or any of the other parades, like this must have been just, one for the books. But who watched the pageant if almost everybody was in the pageant?
True. It's true. And again, as you go back through the records, you read like 3 Decades of Devotion, which is the story of the first 30 years of that led to the creation of the Tryon Palace Commission and the restoration. Time and time again, the meetings are being held in her parlor.
Yes.
And as Lindy mentioned, what's interesting to me about this, we think of the New Bern Historical Society and Tryon Palace as being very different entities, but it was the same group of people. And primarily women who would occasionally, I need to say this properly, but frankly, they used men for their purposes, and they were able to do that, these incredibly strong women, so that Minnette was really responsible for beginning the New Bern Historical Society, but the first president was Romulus Armistead Nunn. But I guarantee you, he was doing everything that Minnette told him to do, and if he was smart. But these were exceptional women.
Yes. And one of the women that Minnette turned to was Kate Reynolds. Kate Reynolds was probably one of the least directly involved with the palace, but she really played a critical role in laying the foundation. She was from Winston-Salem, and I will say right now, one of the themes that you're going to hear is the role of the West and the Piedmont regions in the state. This is where a lot of the driving force comes from in recreating the palace. So Reynolds was from Winston-Salem. Of course, she married into the Reynolds family. Her husband was the co-founder and chairman of R.G. Reynolds Tobacco. She was a philanthropist at heart. Her organization that she founded is still active, mostly in promoting health and health outreach, but she was also committed to history. She was active in preserving the Daniel Boone Trail and putting up a marker along that, and for saving architecturally significant structures. And so it's to Kate that Minnette turns for critical funding of the New Bern pageant. And she was also, the similar connection between all of these is that Reynolds is the state regent for the Daughters of the American Revolution. And I think that's another theme. A lot of these women were affiliated through that organization as well.
And Kate Reynolds, if I remember correctly, she gave $5,000 towards the pageant, with the instructions that any funds that weren't used for the pageant were to be returned to her.
Yes.
Well, they were very frugal, and there was quite a substantial amount left over. It was returned to her, and she turned around and regifted that money for the construction of Tryon Palace. So I think officially it's the first gift that was given for the reconstruction of Tryon Palace. And that, of course, came from the leftover funds from the 1929 pageant.
Right. They put that in an investment fund, which you can imagine in 1929. It took a little bit of time for that to grow appropriately. I think one of the things that, Reynolds was very emphatic in a letter to Minnette that this movement to rebuild the palace, that this had to come from North Carolina women. And she was, in the letter, she's underscoring that. She's making, an emphasis on women are going to lead this program. They're going to be key in that. And at this point, they're chiefly talking about the stable, preserving that, and then kind of thinking ahead towards reconstruction. So there is that small nest egg that's able to be set aside for that project. And of course, then I think, 1929, we can all think of a few historical hiccups that are going to kind of get in the way of any forward movement on that project. Great Depression, a massive world war, and then Kate Reynolds' own illness and death in 1946, which, she did not live to see that project come to fruition. But here are some of the lovely ladies from the pageant. I think this is my favorite image from the event. All right, and then of course, one of our next key figures is Ruth Coltrane Cannon. again, that Western and Piedmont region leadership coming to the fore. She's educated in Concord. You'll have to pardon my Midwestern mispronunciations of things. I called it Concord. And I was told that they were never conquered. They were always Concord.
Her grandson would tell you that he comes from Concord, never conquered.
But she's also educated at Greensboro College, and she majored in history. And one of the interesting things is that history is not a major component of education, either in your primary and secondary or at the college level. Not yet. And yet this is what she chooses. In an era when women are not as often going to college, she's choosing to be educated in history, which I think is quite fascinating. And then, of course, she's in the 1920s and 30s getting her start with the DAR, and also works a lot with memorialization through the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So she's getting this practice in leading these efforts towards, commemorating different historical moments. And then, of course, she's part of the Cannon family, Cannon Mills. So, now we've got, R.J. Reynolds and Cannon, so two of the major industries in the state that are, kind of coming together to support the palace.
And the Cannons, through their foundations, have been consistently supportive. I don't think there's ever been a period in the history of this restoration when they haven't been strong supporters. And of course, her grandson was the chairman of the Tryon Palace Commission for many years, and so they have been great friends of this place and of this story from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So another area where everybody kind of comes together in this unique way is through a 1939 publication, Old Homes and Gardens of North Carolina. And I think it's important to talk about the colonial Williamsburg moment and the kind of effect that it's having, not just here, but kind of everywhere. That effort under Rockefeller auspices, where they are basically preserving an entire city in its colonial appearance, and that is influencing a lot of these women to turn to North Carolina's architectural treasures and try to preserve them in similar ways, or at least bring attention to them in similar ways.
And indeed, it was the executive director at Williamsburg who encouraged the publication of this book. People often ask me, is there some sort of rivalry? And if you go back early on, some of the strongest proponents of the reconstruction of Tryon Palace were the people at Williamsburg, and indeed, of course, because the Rockefellers had been instrumental in that effort, there were some early overtures to the Rockefellers who were very respectful and very encouraging, but also said they pretty much had their hands full with what they were doing at Williamsburg.
Right.
But there was a very good relationship in these days. And of course, you notice the photographs in this book were again from our wonderful Bayard Wooten. But one of the things that I think also shows up here, and Lindy has alluded to it by mentioning the people in the western part of the state. Today, there's a tendency among some people to think of Tryon Palace as an important New Bern historic site. But there was very much a sense that this was important for the state and indeed for the nation. There were people, it's amazing as you look at the correspondence, there are academics and there are historians from across the nation who are very much encouraging this effort, and in many cases are quite hands-on. Museum directors in New England and in New York who were directly involved, so that one of my fears is that we become a little bit parochial and think that this is our project, but it really belonged to a whole lot of people from across the nation, and that's something that we need to keep in mind because we still need those people. or their descendants or their friends.
Yes.
But this books like this were tremendously important in letting people know what the ambitions were.
Yeah, and I think that one of the other things about publications, well, I'm struck by the irony here. This suddenly comes to me. So the emphasis from the West and the Piedmont region, what a switch that is from the original Palace, right? Like if any of you are familiar with the history of the original Palace, it's the drop that makes the cup overflow when individual settlers in the Piedmont are like, we don't want to pay taxes for this building. It's too much. We don't have enough cash. And this is, what leads, kind of spill over into the regulator rebellion. So here we have the reconstruction driven by, the same group.
In fact, one of the letters from an early donor was that his donation was to make up for the regulators and what the regulators had done to Governor Tryon. And so he said it's time for us to do penance. And, that was accompanied by a check, but it's a funny letter. So.
Yes. All right. The other thing that I love about this book, this is one of the early ways to publish something, is you don't think that you're necessarily going to sell a lot of copies of this. And we talk a lot about crowdsource funding, right? So there's all sorts of platforms that you can use. This is essentially early crowdsource funding. So everybody subscribes, and if you read the back, it is all who's who of people who will come to be affiliated with the commission to support the palace. So it really is this moment where people are, supporting this early effort, and they're going to continue to be involved along the way. There's nothing new. We can put it on a, new app or whatever, and it's still been done before in some fashion. So now Maude, born in New Bern, married in New Bern, lived quite some time in New Bern, started her family in New Bern, ends up moving to Greensboro. She's the one who's financing the old homes and gardens of North Carolina. She's one of the largest donors to the purchase of the North Carolina Royal Charter, which is still here, still safe and sound in a vault in our state archives. And she is one of the first people to establish a dedicated trust fund to the Palace project. And I think it's safe to say without her, that private part of the public-private partnership that has been so critical to the Palace, we wouldn't be sitting here today.
And it's interesting because the way she establishes it, she begins with $100,000, which was huge at this time. But eventually, I think the gifts totaled about close to $3 million or a little over $3 million. And again, if you think about that amount of money in this period, it was tremendous. But interestingly, much of that money was to be a bequest upon her death. And at her daughter's insistence, we'll talk about Ms. Kellenberger shortly, she insisted that things progress a little more quickly. She wanted to make sure that her mother had the opportunity to see that it really was going to happen. Now, you can see that Maude Latham sadly died just before the reconstruction of the palace began. But she knew it was a real thing. It was by that point pretty much unstoppable. The state was on board. All the governors for a long period were very much championing this cause. So she didn't get to see the building, but she did get to see her dream. She had grown up a couple of blocks from the palace, and when she was a young girl, her father would take her along George Street and describe the palace that had once been there, and it had always been her dream, if she could, to make sure that palace got rebuilt. So, of all of these women, this woman, she's remembered, of course, in the Latham Garden, that beautiful Latham Garden, but we owe a great debt to her.
I think one of the things that strikes me with most of these individuals is that they were in it for the long haul, whether or not they were here physically or not.
Yeah.
And I think their eye towards the future and securing that history for future generations. Maybe our attention spans are, I mean, while we know that they're shorter nowadays, we keep seeing studies about how our attention spans are shorter. But, this eye towards the long process, even if they weren't here to see it,
Yeah.
this always really struck me as they were committed to it no matter what. And I think the last time I figured out the dollar amount in contemporary terms, it was upwards of $25–30 million. And that's not counting any of the furnishings that she gifted. And so I think, if we think about doing something of this scale today, I don't think we could, and I don't necessarily think that we would do it the same way today. So it was unique for the moment. The moment was right, the people were right to have this project taken. All right, my favorite. So one of the things that is every step of the way, whether she's leading from the front or just sort of there assisting, Gertrude is there from the very beginning. I mean, she grows up here, obviously. She's born in New Bern. Her family is from this area, deep roots here. She's, kind of a protege of Minnette's, coming alongside with those projects. She's involved with the old homes process. She's doing a lot of research on various things. A couple of years ago, I worked on a short biography of her, and so I went and looked at all the local papers. And once upon a time, they published her grades, and they let everybody know who came first. She was always at the top, always one of the best students, and through almost every single time, her name was, whatever the subject was, she was right there at the top. Also college educated, graduated from UNCG today, what is today UNCG. She was extraordinarily bright there. She tested out of her freshman year. She finished a 4-year program in 3 years. My sister, I was telling my sister about Gertrude, and my sister said, "Oh, this makes me question everything I've ever done in my life." It's like she's just, like an overachiever.
And it's interesting because she was, of course, we think of her as a historian and an administrator, but she was always a journalist.
Yes,
I mean, her
absolutely.
career, she was an educator and a journalist, and she always behaved in many ways like a journalist. I'm the son of a journalist, so I like journalists, but that was one of the remarkable things about Gertrude. We hear about her being, head of the DAR nationally and all these organizations, and she had connections all over the country. But there was, and I don't want to offend any journalists in the audience, but there was an aggressiveness about this woman that she was there to get the job done. And I think that in her heart, she was always a bit of a reporter. She was going to make sure that people knew what was happening and that they took advantage of the chance to get on board. I once offended some people, so I may as well offend this group as well by saying that if Gertrude and her friends had been sent against Hitler, the war would have been over in 2 years. There was no man who could stand up to this woman. I was talking with Johnny Ward the other day. Of course, Johnny and David's father was so involved in all of this. And Johnny said, "There are only 2 women I ever knew who could tell my father what to do." Johnny's father was a pretty strong guy, and he said there were 2 women. He said there was a great aunt who showed up at our house once for Christmas, and she was ordering my father around. And after that Christmas, we never saw her again. He said, and the other woman was Gertrude Carraway, and she'd say, "Now, Libby, you go to Raleigh, and this is what you're supposed to do." And Johnny said he went and did it. She was a force, and because she was able to tell the story.
Yes.
She was able. It always came back to telling this story. She's responsible for Constitution Day.
Yes.
She was totally dedicated to the U.S. Constitution, she went, and so when she wanted Constitution Day, she just went to the White House, met with Eisenhower, and all of a sudden we had Constitution Day. And so that was another one of those men that she sent to do something, and he did it. Just an absolutely remarkable woman whose accomplishments, again, it would be hard to, but she dedicated, once she was in this role, this became her focus, and most of us know her for that, but it was only one of many, many, many strong accomplishments.
I think her motto when she was the head of the DAR, because she was the regent for the DAR, she ran unopposed, just so everybody knows. Nobody dared to run against her. But her platform was economy, efficiency, and expansion, which I love the alliteration. But I think, economy and efficiency was definitely a kind of her personal hallmark. And then in expanding the palace, I think we saw just dynamic expansion under her, expanding to different properties, bringing the Stanley House onto George Street, and all of that was done under her leadership.
And of course, her famous list of New Bern First, which she took with her everywhere, and would assure people by the time they had spent a little time with Gertrude, they recognized that the only town in the world that might slightly outdistance New Bern was Bethlehem, but she really did. Total dedication, for example, she was the first one I heard say, and I say it all the time now, that New Bern, of course, is the home of the signer of the U.S. Constitution. And for those of us who are concerned right now about the U.S. Constitution, I don't know how many of us are left, but we had the signer, and what she meant was, if you look at that wonderful painting of the U.S. Constitution being signed, the one that hangs in the U.S. Capitol, the person bending over signing the Constitution is Richard Dobbs Speight from New Bern. So if you look at that, and that's absolutely the iconic painting of the signing of the Constitution, and that's our own. So we do have the signer of the U.S. Constitution, and that was the way Gertrude approached things. So some of her first, people might question a little, but they wouldn't have questioned if they'd been in her presence, I'll tell you.
Yes. And she dedicates that journalistic instinct towards recovering the set of palace plans. She's the one to go to the New York Historical Society, figure out. She wrote to so many different places, and then she's able to, finally identify where those plans are, and she writes a very influential article in 1940 with a leading museum expert in Philadelphia. And one of the things that they say, like, we've got the drawings in hand, and that the palace must rise again after all of this.
And that was an example when you mentioned the man from Philadelphia was named Kendall.
Yeah.
And he was museum director there, and had a direct, strong, hands-on interest in Tryon Palace. We weren't just about New Bern.
No.
We weren't just about North Carolina. These people believed that we had a very important role in national history.
Yes, absolutely. And then our last leading figure, and a lot of times I think she's not counted among the original 5. But I think as far as like staying power and someone who stuck with it for the longest, next to Gertrude, May Gordon Latham Kellenberger, who was Maude Latham's daughter, really deserves to be included in this group of women who were so, important to the palace's history. She is more of a second generation carrying that torch. But I think you said this earlier, that it's not just her, but like this becomes it's like their children.
Yeah.
Like instead of, they're putting that parental emphasis, that work into this place.
And when Ms. Kellenberger would come for Tryon Palace Commission meetings and various other things, it was the closest thing New Bern's ever had to a state visit. I mean, everybody in town knew that she was coming, and everybody walked a little different. And she was a tiny little woman, always in a hat and gloves. But again, she was a force. One of my favorite stories, and I think it's true, which is not usually the case with most of my stories, but you know, if you're on the Tryon Palace Commission, you don't get any freebies. I mean, you eat lunch, you pay for it. But it is reputed that of Mrs. Kellenberger that she even would early on, before there was a commission house or anything, she would hold the meetings of the commission, some of the meetings, on the palace grounds. But she would not allow people to attend the meetings until they'd purchased a ticket. And so you would drive down here from Greensboro, and somebody like Dick Douglas drive down from Greensboro to serve the palace, and arrive and learn that to attend the meeting he'd have to purchase a ticket as well as his lunch. So she again was one of these women who just she was tiny, but she she took no prisoners. Keith McLeese, who's the longest serving member of the Tryon Palace staff, and many of you know Keith, and he came here as an 18-year-old to work and has stayed ever since. And he remembers, of course, Ms. Kellenberger's visits and how everybody was, you know, for days or weeks beforehand was getting ready. But he also remembers that she would, when she left, especially at Christmas time, she would leave a whole group of envelopes so that every member of the Tryon Palace staff had received a cash Christmas gift from her. And he said, I'm not even sure it was legal, and after she died, it stopped, and I've been missing it ever since. But it really was, in many ways, a familial relationship.
Yes.
She was thoroughly dedicated to the people who were making this place happen.
There was a commission meeting minutes where they were debating whether or not they should raise the price of the tickets. And this was in the 70s after they had acquired the Stanley House and moved it. And what should they charge? And, you know, should we charge this for this house and like this for the palace admission? And they were very, like, one of the points that was made, and I think this speaks to charging a ticket even to commissioners, is that they could get a ticket if they raised it for $5. And that was the price of a good steak dinner. So yeah, she had her eye to the bottom line, as it were.
By the way, Lindy's office is in what was Ms. Kellenberger's bedroom in the Jones house.
Yes.
And she, as many people at that time did, love that Pepto-Bismol pink.
It's very pink.
And
very pink.
And so the room's never been repainted, and the bathroom is that pink. And
it's very pink. Very pink.
So that's Lindy's right there, getting all the good vibes. So
It sort of aged to this, I don't know, gentle hue. I don't hate it. I wouldn't pick it, but yet it's grown on me. It's grown on me. So I brought my favorite story about Mr. and Mrs. Kellenberger because, of course, she had her partner in crime, her husband, John, and whither she went, he went too. But this one just tickles me because you'll see. So this is 1962, and the minutes from these meetings are just a rich text. There was never a luncheon. We did not have luncheons. We had delicious luncheons. Every luncheon is a delicious luncheon. So if you were paying for it, you were at least getting a delicious luncheon. But then they had these little tidbits like this. In March and April, the Kellenbergers brought their car loaded to the brim with plants, and we all rolled up our sleeves and worked to get everything in the ground. The Kellenbergers have been scouring abandoned home places in Greensboro in search of flowers and narrowly escaped arrest. The bushels and bushels of iris and jonquils you'll see planted in drifts on the south lawn are the result of their raids. You mean, I don't know, I can't quite see her wielding a spade and invading her neighbor's lawns, but, apparently this was what they were doing. But it's just such a rich story of her dedication that they're even gonna, stoop to making sure that the gardens are looking the best that they can possibly be. So we wanted to kind of also bring some attention to some of the other influential members of this group of people that were leading the charge here. And this is just a tiny snapshot. Of course, there's been lots of commission members. There was the original group in 1945 when Governor Cherry, set the group up. But in 1959, when the palace was opened, these were some of the people that were on the board. And as you can see, it is primarily made up of leading North Carolina women with a few key men who are on the board. You have Inglis Fletcher, who's there. She was the American writer and a novelist.
And her granddaughter lives here in New Bern now. If any of you know Inglis Walsh, whose husband is a urologist here, that's her granddaughter.
Ruth Wales DuPont, the DuPont family. This is the DuPonts of Winterthur Museum fame. She was also heavily involved. They put her to work with furnishings because she had such a good eye for 18th century pieces. Mrs. Thomas Mosley of Kinston, Mary Virginia Horn of Wadesboro. She and her sister Elizabeth were heavily involved in the furnishings as well for a very long time. So she's making a lot of the key decorative arts choices, went on the big buying trips to England and that type of thing. She's also heavily involved with the preservation of the Corgaston House, which was part of the palace complex for a little bit. And then, of course, May Gordon, Latham Kellenberger, and her husband, John, and Mrs. Paul Borden of Goldsboro, Carol Rogers of Tryon. And then in the back row, we have Gertrude, who is, of course, from New Bern, first executive director of Tryon Palace. Mrs. Richard J. Reynolds of Winston-Salem, Mrs. W.H. Belk of Charlotte, Maude Davis Bunn, who was a Raleigh Times columnist and the wife of a North Carolinian lawyer, Robert Stallings, the mayor of New Bern.
And of course, many of you know Mary Parrish,
Yes.
and that's her father,
Yes.
Robert Stallings.
Mrs. Lawrence Sprunt out of Wilmington.
And the Sprunts, again, it's wonderful for me to see these other places like Wilmington that were often as excited about what was going on here. And
Yes.
Mrs. Sprunt is a good example.
And very influential in preserving the histories of the Cape Fear
Exactly,
as well. So
exactly.
they're turning that same passion towards
It was not seen
New
so
Bern.
much as competitive as
Right,
complementary.
Right,
So.
right. Mrs. Melville Broughton, she was the wife of a former governor. I think one of the things that you see too here is that you have all of these different administrations, but this shared vision, very early on. All of these governors, regardless of whether or not they agreed on policy or had the same vision for the state, they all share this vision of bringing the palace back to life.
They were all scared of Gertrude.
Well, that's probably true too. Mrs. Michener from Laurinburg, she was a longtime head of the garden committee and made a lot of the crucial decisions about how our landscape was laid out. She's one of those women who was rolling up her sleeves and putting in gardens. She has to have been just incredibly tenacious, because one of the things, if you talk to any of our staff who are in the landscaping in our grounds department, the gardens died repeatedly because they didn't have the right soil or they didn't bring in the right plants. And then Mrs. Michener were like, well, we dug it all up and we dug out the topsoil and we brought in more stuff and then we replanted everything. And so they just had an incredible, talk about that long vision for, they might not be around to see those shrubs ever really take root, but they were going to work really hard at it.
And when you're walking around in the palace gardens and you come on the left side as you're facing the river, there's a little Greek temple.
Yes.
And that temple is the Michener Temple. And I was fortunate enough to be good friends with her son and her grandsons, and I always reminded them whenever I'd see them that the Michener Temple was standing well, and
Yes.
it's still there, a beautiful little spot.
George Ross is the head of the North Carolina Department of Conservation and Development, and that's where we started. We didn't start with the Department of Archives and History. We started with Conservation and Development, and then we got transferred over. Another governor's wife, Mrs. Omax Gardner of Shelby, Mrs. A.B. Stoney of Morganton, the state attorney general was a part of the commission, Mrs. Paul P. McCain.
Now, those of you who remember, if you've been here a while, you probably remember Betty Ray McCain. This lady was her mother-in-law. So when Betty Ray became the Secretary of Cultural Resources, she always had a sort of a special thing for us, and I think it was because she had grown up hearing from her mother-in-law so many wonderful stories about Tryon Palace, the early days. So.
And then, of course, New Bern's own David Livingston Ward.
And you know, it's interesting because we're talking about the women tonight, but and certainly, as I mentioned, Gertrude would send Libby Ward to Raleigh to do her work. But he was probably, and I don't want to embarrass anyone in the audience, he may be his daughter-in-law, but he was probably the most, I think certainly the most powerful man in North Carolina at the time in the political world. He had been Speaker of the House of Representatives. By this point, he's a state senator. And what he wanted done often, almost always, got done. And so while these women were tremendously important, they had some good allies, and Libby Ward was one of them. We would not be sitting here in this place with this palace next to us were it not for him.
Yes, I think if they knew who their allies were, and they knew who to tap for various expertise, and they weren't afraid to go and ask or maybe volunteer certain people to do certain things. This is one of the photographs of one of those first commission meetings. I believe this is about 1955. This is actually, I think, in one of the houses that was left standing while they were working on the palace reconstruction. Of course, May is behind the desk chairing the commission, as she did for 27 years. Gertrude is taking notes. And we're not sure who the lady is who is presenting. So if anyone knows, let us know, because we don't recognize her.
Does anyone recognize the lady who's standing and speaking? Of course, that's Mr. Kellenberger with his back to us, but we just can't find out who she is.
And then, of course, the work that they did to basically take an entire neighborhood that had grown up over the palace site and move that and relocate buildings and basically transform an entire neighborhood that had sprung up into the site that we know today.
And some of these houses still exist. Some were demolished, but some of these houses still exist in different parts of New Bern. I once did a little program with Peter Sandback, and we called it New Bern, North Carolina's most elegant mobile home park. And it, you know, we're familiar with so many houses that have been moved, but you can find some of these houses scattered around New Bern today.
Yeah. And the star is on the stable. So the stable had kind of stayed put, hadn't been moved around too many times, and it's right there in the center of it all. But to get to the palace grounds, they had to move a highway. And that's, I think, one of the things that we do lean on when we tell this story, is that these are women who were powerful enough to move, you know, US 70, basically, you know, the bridge over the Trent River in pursuit of uncovering the original foundations.
And it was, again, seeing the opportunity.
Yes.
Cherry Point had been greatly enlarged, tremendously enlarged during the Second World War. And this was the primary way that you got west from Cherry Point, along with the railroad. But if you were driving a big truck, you went across this bridge. And I remember when I was a boy, I thought it was exciting. My mother thought it was the most frightening thing in the world because the bridge moved. It was like a wooden roller coaster. It moved. And if that wasn't enough, out about 2/3 of the way across towards James City, there was a sharp turn in the bridge. And so you were negotiating that little narrow lane, meeting traffic on a moving bridge going around a curve. Other than that, there was nothing scary about it. But they got the highway moved and the bridge moved, but it was a happy coincidence that bridge had to be replaced. The Defense Department was pushing for it to be replaced, and these women were smart enough to know that the time had come and this was the time to get it done. And so they got the highway moved and they got the bridge moved and replaced. But believe it or not, in my youth, if you were heading to Moorhead, that's the way you went.
And I think one of the, we've talked about how they were able to tap the best people. And so when they were ready to reconstruct, again, they were leaning on experts in the field. So Perry Williams, who was one of the lead architects of the firm that had been responsible for Colonial Williamsburg, they're bringing him on board. He's doing the drawings. They're leaning on Morley P. Williams, one of the leading landscape architects at the time, who had done projects like Mount Vernon and the White House and Stratford Plantation. And this again, and then pulling in people like Gregor Norman Wilcox, who is from Los Angeles and is a leading curator at this time, and his wife, who was an expert in Chinese export porcelains, really pulling on a lot of the leading figures of the moment to help with this project.
And that again makes the point. This was seen as a
Absolutely.
project of national
Absolutely.
significance.
Yes. And then, of course, finally, then we got to the grand opening. And again, another governor who is, making this a part of his administrative goals to see this project opened up.
Luther Hodges, of course, later became Secretary of Commerce under John F. Kennedy. And you see him there, the opening of the gates. And by the way, the gates, which are now back,
Yes.
if you notice those magnificent gates, and there are some fascinating stories associated with them. But that was on the opening day of the palace. I remember, it's etched in my mind, I remember seeing the two of them standing there, and the ribbon was cut and the gates swung open, which they now can do again. For a long time they couldn't swing open, but that was an exciting time in this town.
So one of the things when we were going through photographs, we ran across a couple things that we thought were fun. Nelson picked out a familiar face in this photograph.
If you look in this photo, and I believe this may be Mrs. Kellenberger with some of the members of the Council of State, and of course the governor. But if you look, standing right next to that console table is someone you may know. His name is Johnny Ward, and I look at that, and then of course Johnny is my dear friend, but I say, my God, what happened? Because he's very handsome. He's very handsome in that picture. But there he is. But the Council of State has met here a number of times, and of course they were meeting in the council chamber. When people see this picture, they immediately notice that they were sitting on artifacts. We couldn't do that today.
No. No. And then we found another familiar face, or at least Nelson did.
I was looking at this picture. I think there's that same meeting. And actually, I looked, and there's my father back in the, standing in front of that window. He's probably looking out of the window, not paying attention. But nonetheless, that was sort of fun to see my old papa.
Yeah. So here's one of the celebrations after the building had been opened, and they're all dressed, of course, in their very best. And of the 6 original women who were kind of responsible for all of this, only 3 lived to see the opening. And I think, again, that's one of those things where they were doing this work for future generations, for us really, that are sitting here, and for our children and our children's children. They never got to see the fruits of what they had done, but there were the individuals who did get to experience that. And they all look pretty pleased with themselves, I think. Mm-hmm. That's about as much as a smile as I've ever seen on a photograph of Gertrude.
It's true. And what's interesting to me, again, and I need to be careful how I say this, but these women were so dedicated to the history of our nation, and they had so many people who were there with them. I don't know, is that Graham Barton there? Maybe not. I thought with this light, it's hard to tell. But anyway, his grandfather, who was a congressman, I mean, the people that they involved in this, it was a great patriotic cause.
Yes.
Not nationalistic, but patriotic
Yes.
cause. They loved and had a strong sense of place, and they loved this history. They loved the Constitution, as I say. Gertrude was totally dedicated to that, and I hear some things today that seem so disrespectful to all of that, and I think we really need. It's a shame we don't have some of these voices, because I don't think they'd put up with it. They knew what they thought this country was about, and they didn't think it was perfect. And it's, as we look at this, we have to say, it's this is a different era, and we're talking about primarily wealthy white people, but the excitement spread everywhere.
Yes.
And they didn't, from my knowledge of them, they didn't believe things were perfect, but they believed that by respecting the history, we could make things more perfect.
Yeah.
And they were also one of the very dear parts of this time. I had a wonderful friend, many of you knew, Luke Martin, Jr., who was the lead brick mason for the reconstruction of the palace. And Luke met a lot of discrimination during his time. He had, he was born during Jim Crow. His father, not his grandfather, his great-grandfather, his father was an enslaved man. And then Luke was born in 1917. By the way, his father was 80 when he fathered him. So I used to, when Luke's father, when he escaped from slavery, he joined the U.S. colored troops and fought in the Civil War. And I used to tell Luke, your daddy fired live ammunition a lot of places other than the battlefield. I mean, when an 80-year-old can father a son like Luke, but what I love is that Luke and people like Morley Williams became very close. And we were living in a time that was the end of the Jim Crow era. It's reflected in many of these pictures. But the personal relationships, some of those personal relationships, and Luke never forgot the mutual respect they had for each other. In fact, he told me once, he said, I was worried when I was working on the bottom level of the palace. And Mr. Williams came in and I said, I just can't get these bricks exactly right. And he said, Morley Williams said, they didn't the first time either. We don't want them exactly right.
Yeah.
But it was very dear to hear his stories in a very difficult time. So inevitably, our presentation has been primarily, a reflection of that time. But there were a lot of people who were equally devoted in their own way, and there's some wonderful stories from that period. If you never knew Luke Martin, you should have. You got here too late. He died in 2015, but these were wonderful stories.
Well, and I think, one of the things that we wanted to call out too is the role of a lot of other women who weren't at the forefront, but were providing that groundwork. I think there's lots of people, again, it goes back to that idea of the prism, right? How we twist it tells us different stories. And the hostesses that were, so key to getting this site open to the public And we have one example here. This is our former director of operations, Susan Briley. This is her mother, Frances Reisman. And if you were invited by Gertrude, this was a great honor. She didn't, just open this up to anyone. And I think one of the interesting things about this letter, which is very long for an invitation to come to a class to be trained, she calls the classes interesting and helpful. And that is like such a, covert way of saying it's going to be real hard. Because when you look at, a lot of women saved their materials, like this is a college level class that Gertrude was teaching them in decorative arts and history and exams. And people voluntarily submitted to this. They signed up in droves. In fact, they had to cut it off at 125 applicants because they actually couldn't physically have all of them in the buildings. And these are the key public-facing roles who are working with Gertrude to make the palace available to the public. And then we have one great picture here of the hostesses with First Lady Pat Nixon. Again, speaking to that very broad interest in the site, that this is not just a North Carolina story, that this is a national story, and that even presidents and their wives were interested in this project.
And she was here to cut the ribbon for the John Wright Stanley House. The John Wright Stanley House had been moved to its third site, which is the one on George Street, and was restored. And it was very appropriate that that house would become part of the palace complex. It had served for a while as New Bern as the public library, but it had been very important as an inspiration for many of these women who were attached to rebuilding the palace, because the Stanley, being academic and being high style, it gave them a little bit of a window into what could be. And so when that building was moved to its current site, and they decided here again, they thought big. They could have invited anyone, but they wanted the First Lady of the United States to cut the ribbon, and Pat Nixon came and cut the ribbon. Yeah. And I think that was about 3 months before all of the Watergate stuff blew up. So this may have been the last picture of her smiling, but we have it, and that was a grand,
it was a special moment,
a grand
for
visit.
Sure. Yes. So one of the things that you said earlier today when we were talking was about seeing these people as real people, not just icons. And I thought that was a particularly meaningful way of, I think they would want to be seen as real people as well.
Yeah, it's very important because, again, today, even for people who recognize, what their contributions were, it is very easy to see them as icons, as portraits on a wall. But these were very rare, very real people and very rare people. I was lucky enough to know a few of them, as were many of you in the room lucky enough to know some of these folks, and they were complex, but they were singular in their devotion to getting this project done. And it was a huge project, and required monumental efforts, and they did it. And we forgot to do our advertising. This book, the David Brooks book, is available in the Palace Gift Shop, and also this pretty pink candle here, I'm told, has arrived for sale, and it's called The Dreamers. This candle is The Dreamers. It's dedicated to these dreamers. So if you take that candle home and light it, then you'll get a lot of inspiration, and and we will get some of your cash. So,
well, one of the things that Mary, our shop manager, shared was when the craftsperson who was coming up with the candles, they wanted to make it yellow, and she was like, "Oh no, it can't be yellow. It has to be pink." And I think May would obviously approve of that choice.
Yeah, absolutely. So.
I think for me, the thing that's just amazing is these women could not walk down to the local bank and open a bank account, and yet they moved a highway, they moved a neighborhood, they went out and they pulled the best people for this project, and what an amazing feat that was, just of perseverance and never letting anything stand in their way. I think a lot of us would have just given up after a Great Depression, a World War, the devotion of all of those resources that you're going to need for building, 2 war efforts, and then the economic hiccups, after, in the post-war period. And they didn't let any of that stand in their way. They kept this as their constant.
And they were remarkable, though not unique, in this town and in this area. This town was full of strong women. I've often said that I had a little trouble at the beginning of the modern women's movement because I could not understand what people were talking about when they talked about glass ceilings and women not being able to do that. Heck, if you lived in New Bern, your job, if you were a male, was to step aside. And I see Joan Schaefer sitting there. Her mother, Kathleen Oringer. She in her realm was just. These women were absolutely in control.
Yes,
and I look back,
group.
For example, and it goes back a long way. If you go to the Chelsea restaurant. That building, that fine brick building, was built as Middle Street in New Bern began to change from wooden buildings to brick buildings. That building was built by a black female entrepreneur named Lucinda Stanley. And at the height of Jim Crow, she built that building. And she rented it to white male merchants like Caleb Bradham, and couldn't use the front door. But they all paid her rent. So who won? So, but that tradition of women, in fact, you could go all the way back, to Margaret Tryon.
Absolutely.
Margaret Tryon, knew much more about military affairs than her husband. He might have been a little more successful in some of his endeavors had he let her lead the troops. But that's a long tradition. So these women, there's so many we could talk about. We've just talked about these tonight because they have such a strong association with this place.
Yes.
But they were the movement of the clubs. Yes. They found a way to make the difference.
Absolutely.
And they will always be an inspiration.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we have probably exhausted everyone's time. But we thank everyone for joining us. And thank you for coming.
You all are brave and strong to listen to us. And I appreciate it.
All right. We hope everyone will join us for the reception afterwards and have your questions ready. We'll hopefully be able to answer. Thank you.